Yo, parish orphans and retrogrades. Breaking news. The Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith declares the late sententiae excommunication of former U.S. Apostolic Nuncio, Archbishop Carlo Maria Vigano, after finding him guilty of the reserved delict of schism at the conclusion of a July 4th trial. There it is. Archbishop Carlo Maria Vigano. On July 4th, 2024, the Congress of the Dicastery of the Doctrine of the Faith met to conclude the extrajudicial penal process referred to in Canon 1720 CIC against the Most Reverend Carlo Maria Vigano, titular Archbishop of Ulpiana, accused of the reserved delict of schism, citing Canon 751 and 1364, Article 2, SST, his public statements manifesting his refusal to recognize and submit to the Supreme Pontiff, his rejection of communion with the members of the Church subject to him, and of the legitimacy and magisterial authority of the Second Vatican Council are well known. At the conclusion of the penal process, the Most Reverend Carlo Maria Vigano was found guilty of the reserved delict of schism. The Dicastery declared the late sententiae excommunication in accordance with Canon 1364, Code Section 1. The lifting of the censure in these cases is reserved to the Apostolic See. This decision was communicated to the Most Reverend Vigano on 5 July 2024, which is today's date. Parish orphans and retrogrades. This is what's going on now. Archbishop Vigano is excommunicated. He is a prelate who most of us, the parish orphans and retrogrades in this audience, have followed, rooted for, in his at least initially moderate criticisms of the Pope. We've followed the case, and we have, understood the frustrations of Archbishop Vigano and understood even initially the inspirations of Archbishop Vigano. But I will say, over the last couple of years, I just thought to myself, or said to Steph, Archbishop, I said out loud when I would see some of the things he's saying, you have to toe the line. What expression did you use, Steph? You said, walk the straight and narrow or something like that. You have to be careful when you issue criticisms of the Pope. I mean, some people have said that to me, and I'm nowhere near the level of bold affirmative declaration that Archbishop Vigano is. I don't think that when one says, wow, the Pope uses an expression like the media is often infatuated with copra, that is shit, coprophagia or coprophilia. I think when I say this Holy Father has a foul mouth, I mean, that's really, really surprising. His enemies are coprophagiacs or coprophiliacs. Really foul. I'm sorry. I think there's a distinction of kind there, because there is, between saying that and saying this Pope is not Pope. I know it certainly. And the Second Vatican Council was not a valid council. Parish orphans and retrogrades, if you can't tell the difference, then I'm not sure you're going to make it. Even when the Holy Father makes statements in, chapter 8 of Amoris Laetitia, that strongly and eventually do declare that communion can be given to the divorced and civilly remarried. And you just say, well, that's just not the faith. That's not Roman Catholicism. That's not the same thing as Archbishop Vigano saying, I know he's not Pope, and I know Vatican II isn't a real council. So I know that there are times when I struggle with mouthiness. I know there are times that as just a man and as a sinner, I really can overspeak. And it's when you overspeak, it's never in charity, is it? And I've done so on the program before, but there are never times where I'm going to get excommunicated for it. You have got to walk the line in criticisms of the Pope. There's nowhere that says you can't criticize the Pope. Canon 212 says you can. It even says you should at times. But challenging the validity of this Pope while he lives, I'm not saying that there's no possibility that any Pope could eventually become an anti-Pope. I'm not saying that. But to say that he's not Pope or V2 wasn't a council, that's a bridge too far. And you don't know me, Timothy Gordon, as a moderate. There's a pretty good article up by Father Raymond D'Souza on National Catholic Register today called Archbishop Vigano's Schism Case, 5 Issues to Consider. That was up before today. The Archbishop had until Friday to formally respond in person or in writing, and he just sort of didn't. I mean, this is from a while ago, but I want to run through the five issues that Father D'Souza thinks we ought to consider. Before this all took place, before the schism happened this morning. Okay, so here are 5 considerations that Father D'Souza gave last week. First off, Archbishop Vigano sought separation from the church, which is always runs with the delict of schism. Like the Brer Rabbit stories, it seems that Archbishop Vigano wants to be thrown into the briar patch, eager for the disciplinary consequences of his actions. Why he regards the briar patch as welcome territory is a matter for speculation, and it is a mystery why Archbishop Vigano was so brash. It's quite possible to offer constructive or otherwise criticism of Pope Francis and his program without questioning either his legitimacy or that of Second Vatican Council. And even if you have private misgivings about the legitimacy of either this pontificate or the Second Vatican Council, don't affirm as if you know. Okay, so that's the first thing.
Because obviously the church declares that sort of statement, who is and is not Pope. We don't have that power.
Yeah, this is so basic. And I'm not saying he's acting like a Protestant. There's this one area of overlap that is kind of Protestant-y. Well, I declare, or my natural reason declares. Yeah, but the church has to declare. I mean, this is basic.
Right.
This is so basic.
And I'm seeing in chat that another Pope-splainer is starting his podcast here in about 8 minutes. And, honestly, what I find very sad about the whole situation is the gloating and happiness that some are having when somebody becomes excommunicated. This is a very sad and somber affair. This is not something to be standing on your soapbox declaring that you have victory in a horrible situation like this. I think for a lot of us, I guess you'd call us trads, the last few years, I know myself personally, I've had to, in confession many times, confess that I've been very angry at the Pope and have had some less than flattering thoughts. And it's something that I actually do feel quite guilty about. That doesn't mean that I don't understand the anger. I certainly do. That's why I find myself in confession. about this subject. But it's something that I think respect goes both ways.
Right. I'm guessing who's running that Pope-splaining podcast, which will gloat. It's very sad when an otherwise goodly member of the body of Christ has been separated from the body of Christ. That's a bummer.
And also, I think that, it's also kind of ironic that this same podcaster is, declaring other people to be excommunicated when he's saying, oh, but people can't say who is and isn't Pope. It's like, isn't the argument that the church is the one that decides who is and isn't Pope and who is and isn't excommunicated?
Right.
You can't say one and then totally deflect on the other.
Right. Of course, there's the issue of apostasy. What happens in the church in ecclesiology in the case of apostasy of all the highest ranking prelates? We don't know. And it's conceivably possible that if everyone's so apostatized at the top that, there would be a day where you have to rely on your natural reason, which is why I'm saying, with Archbishop Vigano, when he speculated a little at the beginning, I'm like, hey, yeah, who's not speculating? These are crazy times. But he just went down I'm reading from the second point of Father D'Souza, questioning Vigano's mental health. He went down a steep downward trajectory and Father D'Souza is quoting Ed Condon, a steep downward trajectory over the last 5 years, denouncing Pope Francis in, quote, canonically unambiguous terms. So this is canonist Ed Condon of the Pillar. And he's like, look, the charge of schism against Vigano is, a lot of people think, long overdue. And I don't mean the Michael Loftons of the world that are rooting for it. I'm just saying he's denounced Pope Francis in canonically unambiguous terms where Pope Francis almost has to do this. I don't know why he fell down such a steep slope so quickly. And, to question his mental health out of defense for his own soul doesn't seem out of line. The third thing that Father D'Souza reminds us is that schism is a grave matter. In denouncing his summons by the DDF, Archbishop Vigano compared himself to Archbishop Lefebvre, founder of the Society of St. Pius X in the 70s, excommunicated in 88 for consecrating bishops without a papal mandate. Vigano flatters himself. Archbishop Lefebvre, for all his subsequent troubles, was an admirable missionary in Africa for many years. Far from going into hiding, he founded a community. Archbishop Vigano was likely observing that many of Lefebvre's followers considered his punishment harsh compared to the latitude granted many others in the 1970s. Schism is serious. Rupturing the communion of the church threatens to cut the faithful off from sacramental grace. Being outside communion here below can lead to being outside communion of the saints in eternity. Well, I think it does. I don't think it can. I haven't even done a whole deep dive into the remote possibilities of making it into heaven while excommunicated. But let's just say with Father D'Souza, it's a grave matter. Number 4, Father D'Souza's point that he wrote about before today. Whataboutism abounds. The term whataboutism has entered political and cultural debates in recent years. One criticizes Donald Trump for his treatment of women. Instead of addressing the charge per se, his side says, what about Bill Clinton? Every school teacher and parent knows that whataboutism arises in matters of discipline. A child disciplined for X asks, what about so-and-so who also did X and did not get punished? Well, and people are going to talk about Father Rupnik or Father James Martin. And I'm not sure that I can condemn the whataboutism because it's so automatic. But Father D'Souza is right. It's not a convincing reason that discipline against X cannot proceed because it has not been employed against Y. And that is, again, Pope-splainers will engage in whataboutism of their own. When you're like, they'll respond to whataboutism with further whatabout. If you're like, well, what about Rupnik? What about Father Martin? And then he'll say, well, what about Cardinal Burke? So it becomes an endless cycle. It's like, well, Cardinal Burke has never expressed himself the way our Archbishop Vigano was.